Welcome to the Past in Pictures channel. Be sure to subscribe and like so you don't miss out on more videos like this one. The chief of South Vietnam's National Police appears in one of the most controversial episodes involving a suspect linked to the Viet Cong, illustrating the harshness of the Vietnam War, marked by intense clashes between South Vietnamese forces and communist guerrillas. This episode in 1968 revealed the major human impact of local and international conflicts. The discovery of victims in a collective area near Hue on April 11, 1969, revealed the gravity of the insurgent occupation of the city during the Tet Offensive. A woman recognizes her husband and covers part of his clothing with her conical hat, symbolizing the civilian impact and the pain of families during this difficult phase of the Vietnam War. Journalist Seymour M. Hersh revealed the My Lai case in 1969, where about 400 Vietnamese civilians lost their lives during an action by American troops, causing worldwide reaction. This report exposed one of the gravest episodes of the Vietnam War and created pressure for official investigations, affecting public opinion and United States policy. The Tet Offensive marked a decisive moment in the Vietnam War when Viet Cong guerrillas entered the area of the United States Embassy in Saigon on January 31, 1968. For 6 hours, a small group controlled part of the compound, causing heavy confrontation and casualties among American military personnel. Vietnamese crowds climbed the wall of the United States Embassy in Saigon on April 29, 1975, on the eve of the end of the Vietnam War. This episode symbolizes the fall of Saigon, marking Vietnam's unification under communist rule and the end of American military intervention in the country, transforming the regional geopolitical landscape. Medic Thomas Cole, hit in the eye, continued caring for Sergeant Harrison Pell after a firefight on January 30, 1966, while both belonged to the United States 1st Cavalry Division in An Thi in the Central Highlands. This clash reflected the intense struggle of the Vietnam War. The Battle of Hamburger Hill, fought in May 1969, involved the United States 101st Airborne Division in intense clashes against communist forces in Vietnam. Although the capture of Dong Ap Bia was a military victory, the heavy losses and harshness of the operation caused major political controversy, intensifying protests against the war. The advance of North Vietnamese tanks through the gate of the presidential palace marked the end of the Vietnam War on April 30, 1975, with the fall of Saigon, which was later renamed Ho Chi Minh City. This event consolidated communist reunification and had a major impact on regional geopolitics. Off the coast of Vietnam on April 29, 1975, members of the United States Navy aboard the USS Blue Ridge pushed helicopters into the sea to make room for more evacuation flights from Saigon. This critical moment came just before the end of the war, marked by the fall of Saigon to communist forces. During the Battle of Khe Sanh in Vietnam in 1968, American Marines held the defense of the base surrounded by forces of the North Vietnamese Army near Laos. The siege lasted more than 2 months, with constant attacks, difficult terrain, and clashes that marked one of the most tense phases of the war. In Hue, Vietnam, residents crossed the Perfume River in February 1968 to leave areas affected by the Battle of Hue. The confrontation took place during the Tet Offensive and lasted for weeks, involving North Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, and American forces, leaving the city marked by damage and displacement. The situation in Saigon after the Tet Offensive on February 5, 1968, left one city block severely damaged as a result of military actions and fires. And Quang Pagoda, used as a strategic point by the Viet Cong, dominates the affected area, showing the intensity of the conflict. French paratroopers landed near the Dien Bien Phu stronghold on March 23, 1954, during the decisive battle in Indochina. This offensive marked the end of French colonial rule in the region, speeding Vietnam's independence and changing the geopolitical balance in Southeast Asia. The protest against the Vietnam War at Kent State University in 1970 ended in a grave episode when the Ohio National Guard fired on students, leaving 4 dead and 9 wounded. This moment exposed the growing tension between young people and the government, shaping public opinion against military intervention. The Ka Mau Peninsula witnessed emergency care for Cambodian fighter Don Son Huol, hit by American bombing in 1970. This episode portrays the reality of improvised operations during the Vietnam War, when people who were hurt received medical care in rough locations, showing the severe impact of the conflict on the region. Members of local forces examined the remains of a United States Navy plane hit near Hanoi. The A-7C Corsair aircraft, flown by Lieutenant Stephen Owen Musselman, crashed on September 10, 1972. The pilot ejected before the crash and had no confirmed location until March 15, 1973, symbolizing the difficulties of the Vietnam War. Vietnamese workers rebuild the Ham Rong Bridge, vital for transportation over the Ma River and the target of intense American air attacks. The bridge was heavily defended, causing the loss of several aircraft. In 1973, remains of a pilot were recovered there. Viet Cong soldiers and soldiers of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam face each other in the Mekong Delta, a setting of intense clashes during the Vietnam War. The tactic of flanking the opponent reveals guerrilla strength, likely resulting in the neutralization of the enemy unit. A photograph by Hoang Mai records this crucial moment. Viet Cong fighters guarded outposts on the border with Cambodia, using prepared bamboo stakes as defensive obstacles. These irregular warfare tactics, common during the Vietnam War, aimed to make enemy soldiers advance harder, slow their troops, and reveal positions, complicating the advance of American forces. A company of about 130 South Vietnamese troops faced monsoon rain while moving down the river in sampans to carry out a dawn action against a Viet Cong camp on January 10, 1966. The operation caused losses among guerrillas about 13 miles northeast of Can Tho in the flooded Mekong Delta. Over the jungle of South Vietnam on December 26, 1964, a United States Sky Raider aircraft carries out an air action against a Viet Cong position. The marks on the ground indicate earlier operations in an early phase of the war marked by air support, military advances, and clashes in local rural areas. Vietnamese residents protected by American paratroopers left the region in January 1966 as the Viet Cong advanced about 20 miles from Saigon, reflecting the increased United States military presence in Vietnam. The intensification of the conflict marked a decisive escalation of the Vietnam War that would have a global impact. At Red Beach, near Da Nang, South Vietnam, American Marines land at dawn on April 10, 1965. The operation strengthened the United States' presence in the war, with troops, weapons, and equipment arriving by sea to protect bases and expand military actions in the coastal region. United States Army helicopters arrived in an area 50 miles northeast of Saigon in 1966, supporting ground troops during the Vietnam War. The conflict ended on April 30, 1975, with the fall of Saigon, renamed Ho Chi Minh City under communist control. Soldiers of the People's Army of Vietnam advanced near Route 9 in southern Laos during Operation Lam Son 7119, carried out on February 21, 1971, when South Vietnam tried to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The offensive failed, strengthening North Vietnam's control over the conflict's logistics. Private First Class. Bob G. Whitworth of the 11th Light Infantry Brigade of the Americal Division faced intense fighting in the Vietnam War on September 27, 1968, after 3 days without sleep, pursuing troops of North Vietnam's 2nd Division in exhausting combat. Soldiers from the American Airborne Brigade in Phuoc Vinh, Vietnam, wore helmets with the phrase, "War is hell." In the 1960s, the Vietnam War showed the human and strategic impact of the conflict, influencing opinions against this American intervention. Soldiers of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam abandoned their combat boots on a road near Saigon in 1975 after taking off their uniforms to escape capture. The retreat marked the end of the Vietnam War, ending decades of conflict and bringing lasting peace to the country, according to photographer Duong Thanh. New recruits undergo physical exams in Haiphong after the North's volunteer system became mandatory in 1973, calling up all able men. The People's Army of Vietnam grew from 35,000 in 1950 to more than 500,000 by the mid-1970s, challenging the United States. Company 6 of the Yen. My Commune militia trained intensely in 1965 with World War II rifles to face American aircraft operating in Vietnam. Despite outdated weapons, they managed to hit and damage many planes, becoming a symbol of resistance and effectiveness against foreign intervention. The female presence in Vietnam's actions, shown by a 24-year-old fighter in the Mekong Delta, illustrates the crucial role of women in Viet Cong resistance, where they faced great hardship and family losses. By 1973, the war was already showing its deep impact on local society. Lê Minh Truong recorded a fighter moving through the mangroves of the Mekong Delta in 1970, an area affected by Agent Orange, used by the United States to remove plant cover used by the Viet Cong. This practice caused lasting environmental and social impacts, affecting local farming and fishing communities. In the Nam Can forest in Vietnam's Mekong Delta, activists walk masked during the Vietnam War. The masks helped protect their identities in case of capture. Among the mangrove swamps, sending photographs to the north was difficult, and many images were lost or confiscated. The end of direct United States involvement in ground operations in Vietnam was marked by a formal ceremony in Da Nang. This episode in 1972 symbolized the gradual withdrawal of American troops, decisively affecting the course of the Vietnam War and speeding the United States military exit process. After long negotiations in Paris, the signing of the peace accords on January 23, 1973, represented a crucial milestone toward the end of the Vietnam War. The agreement sought to stop hostilities and withdraw American troops, although internal instability in Vietnam continued to affect the region. The Vietnam Peace Agreement was signed on January 23, 1973, in Paris, bringing together Henry Kissinger, United States presidential advisor, and Le Duc Tho, head of the Hanoi delegation. This treaty marked the official end of American participation in the conflict, transforming the international political landscape. Presidential advisor Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho, leader of the Hanoi delegation, signed the Vietnam Peace Agreement at the International Conference Center in Paris, officially ending a long conflict that had marked the region for years. This agreement marked the beginning of the withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. Henry Kissinger, President Nixon's envoy, and Le Duc Tho, representative of North Vietnam, signed the peace agreement on January 23, 1973, at the International Conference Center in Paris. This treaty ended American participation in the Vietnam War, marking the withdrawal of United States troops. Henry Kissinger and North Vietnamese negotiators Le Duc Tho and Xuan Thuy celebrate the Paris Peace Agreement, signed in 1973, which ended direct fighting in Vietnam. This treaty marked a crucial step toward the withdrawal of American troops and the transition of the conflict into a diplomatic phase. Henry Kissinger and Winston Lord traveled toward Paris on January 23, 1973, a landmark date for the signing of the Paris Peace Agreement, which ended American participation in the Vietnam War. This treaty established a ceasefire and the withdrawal of United States troops, changing the course of the conflict in American foreign policy. United States presidential advisor Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho, North Vietnam's main negotiator, met in Gif-sur-Yvette near Paris on November 23, 1972, to begin secret negotiations that led to the peace agreement that ended the Vietnam War in 1973. Henry Kissinger received the 1973 Nobel Peace Prize, together with North Vietnamese diplomat Le Duc Tho, for their negotiations that led to the Paris Peace Accords, which helped end the Vietnam War. This recognition highlighted the role of diplomacy in seeking a resolution to a long and devastating conflict. President Nixon met in New York with Henry A. Kissinger after secret negotiations in Paris with Le Duc Tho of North Vietnam in November 1972. This approach led to the official announcement of hope for an agreement that could end the conflict in Vietnam, marking a decisive moment in the war. Peter Rodman and John Negroponte were traveling to Paris on January 23, 1973, close to the signing of the Paris Peace Agreement, which ended United States participation in the Vietnam War. This agreement marked a turning point by trying to end a conflict that caused deep political and social division. The plenary session at the Palace of Nations in Geneva on July 21, 1954, marked the signing of the Indochina Armistice Agreements, ending colonial fighting and defining territorial divisions in Vietnam. This agreement represented a crucial milestone in ending the First Indochina War and set the stage for future conflicts in the region. General Vo Nguyen Giap, leader of the Viet Minh forces, commanded the communist resistance against French occupation in Indochina. On May 27, 1954, his strategy culminated in the historic victory at Dien Bien Phu, decisive for ending French colonial rule in the region and marking the beginning of Vietnam's independence. Ho Chi Minh, leader of Vietnamese independence, led negotiations with France in Hanoi in March 1946 to prevent the return of colonial rule after World War II. This moment marked the beginning of tensions that led to the Indochina War, which was decisive for Vietnam's national liberation. President Dwight Eisenhower received Ngo Dinh Diem at the White House on May 9, 1957, to discuss the protection of South Vietnam against the communist threat. The meeting marked a strengthening of the United States alliance during the Cold War, intensifying military and economic support in Asia. American military personnel served as advisors in South Vietnam in August 1963, totaling about 14,000 men to contain communist infiltration from the north. The Kennedy administration trusted in victory in guerrilla war, but worried about political instability in Saigon, marked by conflict between Buddhists and the local regime. General William Westmoreland inspects troops of the 1st Battalion, 16th Regiment, 2nd Brigade of the 1st American Division in Bien Hoa, Vietnam, in 1965. His leadership marked the United States military escalation in the war, intensifying the confrontation that reshaped American foreign policy. The arrival of Robert McNamara and Maxwell D. Taylor in Saigon on September 24, 1963, marked the sending of a commission by President Kennedy to investigate the situation in South Vietnam, a crucial point in American military escalation during the Vietnam War, reflecting the United States' effort to control growing local political instability. United States officials returned to Andrews Air Force Base after an inspection of forces in Vietnam in 1967. Among them was Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who would present his findings about the conflict, whose prolongation intensified the internal debate over American participation in the war. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, told President Johnson on July 12, 1967, that military reinforcements were needed in Vietnam, reflecting the worsening conflict. His announcement at the White House indicated the intensification of American participation in the war, marking an escalation that would deeply affect politics. Under-Secretary of State Nicholas Katzenbach answered a senator on August 21, 1967, while defending the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, whose repeal by Congress would place President Lyndon Johnson and the country in a difficult situation in the Vietnam War, reinforcing the American commitment against communist advance. Secretary of Defense Melvin R. Laird ended a crucial 4-day visit to Vietnam on March 10, 1969, speaking with General Crichton W. Abrams and Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker before returning to the United States. This trip marked the moment when the American government was trying to adjust its military strategy during the war in Vietnam. Melvin R. Laird was United States Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War and was responsible for the Vietnamization policy, which reduced the American military presence from a peak of 549,500 soldiers in 1969 to about 27,000 in December 1972, shifting the fighting to South Vietnamese forces. Secretary of Defense Melvin R. Laird visited Vietnam on February 12, 1970, arriving at the American Embassy in Saigon with Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker. The visit took place at a decisive moment in the war, with the policy of Vietnamization underway, aiming to transfer responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. President Nixon received South Vietnamese leader Nguyen Van Thieu for crucial war discussions at Midway Island Airport on June 8, 1969. This meeting represented a significant diplomatic effort to seek a negotiated way out of the conflict that consumed the region and influenced the Cold War. President Nixon was in Dien, near Saigon, on July 30, 1969, surrounded by soldiers of the United States 1st Infantry Division. The visit symbolized direct American involvement in the Vietnam War, a conflict that marked the end of United States dominance in Southeast Asia. Facing an increasingly exhausting Vietnam War, leaders of the United States and South Vietnam met on July 19, 1968, in Honolulu to discuss strategies and peace negotiations in Paris. These talks pointed to the complexity of a conflict that deeply divided opinions and affected regional stability. Opposition lawmakers in South Vietnam burned photos of President Nguyen Van Thieu during a protest on February 13, 1975, in Saigon. This demonstration, aligned with Tet, the Lunar New Year, reflected the worsening political crisis and growing pressure for the leader's resignation amid the weakening of the regime. Peace activists in Central Park, New York, publicly destroyed their draft cards on April 15, 1967, challenging the Vietnam War. This action symbolized rejection of the draft and mobilized the movement against United States involvement, influencing public debate about the conflict. The peace message of the movement against the Vietnam War echoed through major protests, such as the tension between activists and authorities in 1965. Leaders such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Dr. Benjamin Spock criticized the intervention, emphasizing the value of human life and questioning the future after the conflict, mobilizing public opinion against the war. Thousands of protesters gathered in Grosvenor Square in London to protest the Vietnam War surrounding the American embassy. Tension with police took place on March 17, 1968, as global opposition to the conflict was growing, leading to arrests and a strong response from authorities. Peace activists gathered in front of the White House with signs calling for an end to air attacks in Vietnam, denouncing the expansion of the intervention. These demonstrations marked the growing movement against the conflict, which influenced public opinion and pressured for changes in American policy during the 1960s. Protesters in Antioch called for the return of American soldiers from the Vietnam War, carrying signs with messages such as "End the war now" and peace symbols, reflecting the growing movement against the conflict that marked the 1960s and influenced major political changes in the United States. Vietnam Veterans Against the War organized emblematic protests in the United States in the late 1960s, gaining visibility as they demanded the end of a harsh conflict that had already caused thousands of casualties. These confrontations fueled debates about American foreign policy and influenced global public opinion. Anti-war activists organized the Jeanette Peace Parade, an emblematic 1960s protest against the Vietnam War and the internal social crisis in the United States. This mobilization reflected growing public dissatisfaction that would influence American foreign policy and the civil rights struggle, marking progress in peaceful opposition. Protesters in Washington demanded an end to the Vietnam War in the late 1960s, symbolizing growing public exhaustion with the conflict. With the United States flag and the slogan, "Win the War," the protest reflected division in American public opinion and pushed for changes in military policy. Groups in favor of military intervention in the United States used slogans praising duty, honor, and patriotism to encourage enlistment during the Vietnam War. This mobilization strengthened domestic support for the conflict, even amid growing peace opposition affecting American foreign policy. Activists opposed to the Vietnam War promoted emotional support campaigns for American soldiers, even while protesting the conflict through public networks during the 1960s. This contradiction reflected the deep impact of the war on United States society and the growing peace movement calling for an end to the fighting. Journalist David Halberstam stood out in 1964 for covering the Vietnam War for the New York Times, work that earned him the Pulitzer Prize. His reporting revealed the complexity of the conflict, influencing American public opinion and the debate over United States intervention in Asia. Peter Arnett reported with basic equipment in 1963 alongside the Vietnamese Army. His work was essential in showing the reality of the Vietnam War, marking a new era in war journalism by bringing powerful images to a worldwide audience and influencing international public opinion. Morley Safer, a Columbia Broadcasting System correspondent in 1965, stood out in his coverage of the Vietnam War, bringing the American public a direct view of the fighting. His work was crucial in changing how the war was seen, influencing public opinion against the conflict through powerful reporting and revealing images. Neil Sheehan, A.M. Rosenthal, and James L. Greenfield celebrate on May 1, 1972, the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service awarded to the New York Times for publishing the Pentagon Papers. This revelation exposed secrets about the Vietnam War and intensified the debate over transparency and government power. Journalists attend a briefing with military officials in Saigon around 1963, known as the 5 o'clock follies, because the official information was considered inaccurate. Among them, Seymour Topping of the New York Times stands out in the center foreground. Edith Lederer, a journalist for the Associated Press, worked in San Francisco in October 1969, a period marked by intense social changes in the United States. Her work at that time contributed to coverage of protests against the Vietnam War, influencing public opinion and the way historical events were reported with clarity and impact. George C. Carver served as Special Assistant for Vietnam Affairs at the Central Intelligence Agency between 1966 and 1973, a crucial period of the Vietnam War. His role involved strategic intelligence analysis to help the United States guide its actions against communist advance. Richard Helms, former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, gave an interview in April 1975 after leaving office amid Cold War controversies. His departure symbolized internal tensions in the agency during the post-Vietnam period, reflecting challenges in American intelligence in the face of a new world order. The meeting between Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, held on October 13, 1973, happened at a critical moment in the Watergate crisis, which was shaking the United States presidency. The presence of Henry Kissinger reinforces the importance of dialogue about foreign and domestic policy. President Nixon, accompanied by Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird and advisor Alexander Haig, led important decisions during the 1973 crisis, marked by the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. This period reshaped American politics and public trust in government. The arrival of Barbara Powers, wife of U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers, in Moscow on August 13, 1960, marked a tense Cold War moment. The trial of Powers, accused of spying, was scheduled for days later, intensifying the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. Robert McNamara, United States Secretary of Defense, presents strategies for South Vietnam in the mid-20th century, marking an expansion of American action in the Vietnam War. This intervention deepened the regional crisis, creating lasting political and social consequences. General Creighton W. Abrams replaced General William Westmoreland in Saigon on May 4, 1967, becoming his assistant in all matters. This transition marked a change in United States military leadership during the intensification of the Vietnam War. William Porter, Deputy Ambassador in South Vietnam, and Barry Zorthian, Information Advisor in Saigon, were at the White House on June 16, 1966, a crucial moment in the Vietnam War, when the United States was increasing its military involvement to contain communist advances in the region. The arrival of the 1st Australian Battalion in South Vietnam in May 1965 marked a new chapter in the intensification of the Vietnam War, with coverage by correspondents such as Malcolm W. Brown. This international intervention expanded the conflict, affecting politics and worldwide public opinion. Vietnamese soldiers return exhausted aboard a ship after 4 days of operations in the southern swamps in August 1962, an early moment in the intensification of the conflict in the region, which would mark greater United States involvement in the Vietnam War and deeply change Cold War international politics. United States and South Vietnamese soldiers rest near the village of Binh Gia in a tense pause, after nights weakened by the constant threat of the Viet Cong. In January 1965, the conflict was escalating, foreshadowing intense fighting that would mark the long continuation of the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, South Vietnamese military boats patrolled the Mekong Delta, a strategic area for controlling river routes and fighting the advance of the Viet Cong. The presence south of Coconut Monk Island, near Mai Tho, reflected the effort to contain communist actions in this vital region between the 1960s and 1970s. After taking office as President of the United States, Richard Nixon intensified the military presence during the Vietnam War, seeking to contain communist expansion in the region. The visible wear on the "Welcome to Vietnam" sign illustrates the everyday violence faced by American troops, a symbol of the conflicts that marked the 1960s. Richard Nixon, President of the United States from 1969 to 1974, was directly involved in the Vietnam conflict, whose map highlights key regions of Southeast Asia. His policy expanded the war, affecting countries such as Laos and Cambodia, with lasting consequences for the region and global geopolitics. The presidential palace in Saigon symbolized the power of the South Vietnamese government during the Vietnam War. A colonial building with columns and arched windows, it was the setting for crucial decisions until its fall in 1975, a landmark in the end of the conflict and Vietnam's reunification under communist rule. United States and North Vietnamese military officials and diplomats gathered together show the tension that led to the Vietnam War, a conflict shaped by the Geneva Conference negotiations in 1954. This episode was decisive for the division of Vietnam and intensified American intervention, shaping geopolitics during the Cold War. President Nguyen Van Thieu received journalists near Hue, South Vietnam, and invited 100 American peace students to visit the country and clear up misunderstandings about the war. This effort aimed to reduce tensions during the Vietnam conflict in 1969, which had been intensified by protests in the United States. American Marines protected the United States Embassy in Saigon during the Vietnam War, a conflict marked by intense fighting between United States forces and North Vietnam. The S-61 helicopter helped with transport and support, reflecting the military escalation of the 1960s. On March 17, 1973, Lieutenant Colonel Robert L. Sturm, a prisoner of war, was welcomed by his family at Travis Air Force Base in California after being released from the Vietnam War. The conflict ended on April 30, 1975, with the fall of Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City. President Richard Nixon received Admiral John McCain, commander in the Pacific, at the White House in January 1969, while he was recovering from a health problem. The meeting showed concern over the condition of military leaders during the Vietnam War, highlighting strategic challenges during the process of peace talks. American generals who led United States forces during the Vietnam War, such as General Creighton Abrams, were in command during decisive moments. Abrams, who was head of the Military Assistance Advisory Group and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, played a crucial role in the strategy that shaped the conflict until its conclusion in 1975. Vietnamese leaders and civilians display the phrases Chien Dao and Tuan Dan Doan Ket, symbols of unified resistance against foreign occupation during the Vietnam War. This popular unity was decisive for Vietnam's independence and strengthening during the conflicts of the 20th century. In December 1969, American troops advanced through landing zones during the Vietnam War, a conflict that marked intense United States intervention in Southeast Asia. This offensive reflected a strategy of territorial control amid local resistance, influencing the course of the war and international public opinion about it.